Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today. Welcome to Practical User Experience. Like Jenna said, I'm Ken Woodworth. I'm Atten's VP of Design and a partner. I've been working with Atten for over 19 years now, developing digital products for the web. I'm really excited to talk to you today about practical user experience. And I'd like to start by kind of outlining what we're going to look at today. So we're going to start by talking about, what is user experience? What makes for great UX? How does that and think about user-centered design and make sure we're keeping users front and center in our work? Understanding your users. So how do you define the ways you can learn more about your users? What kind of questions can you ask? And then what's in your toolbox? What methods can you use at your organization to learn more about your users? And what does each one take? How much work is involved? What are the steps that they take? So by the end of this webinar, I hope you feel inspired and empowered to take a user-focused approach to your next project. All right, so let's start by kind of defining user experience. So what is a great user experience? Well, when I think about this, I like to think of it as a combination of three things: organizational goals, user needs, and technical limitations, right? So when all of those things work together, that's where you have a great user experience. So let's start by talking about the organization. So who are you as an organization? Have you defined your mission? What is it? When we look at mission statements, they help define the overall purpose of an organization. An effective mission statement is clear and concise. We combine the mission statement with a vision statement to understand the world an organization strives to build. Strong vision statement is long-term and inspirational. And then what are your goals and objectives? What are you trying to do, right? Organizational goals help establish the ways in which an organization will fulfill its mission. And then the objectives are specific, measurable, and time-boxed initiatives that directly align with those goals. We like to think about all of these different aspects of an organization when we're thinking about what it's trying to achieve. Next, we look at your audiences. Who are your audiences? What is their background? Where are they coming from? It's really important when thinking about the different people you might encounter in the life of your organization. Where are they coming from? What are their goals? What's driving them? What are they trying to achieve when they're coming to your website or using your product? And then what are their challenges? What are the things that they're running up against that you need to help make easier for them? And then finally, and probably most important in a lot of the work that we do you have access to your audiences? Do you have a relationship with people that use your product or your website? Are you able to ask them questions or get them to test things, try things, have conversations, that sort of thing? And then finally, the technical limitations. So this is kind of the unfun part, but it's important to think about when we're thinking about the user experience, because there are always going to be technical limitations. So what are you making, first of all? Is it a website, an app? Is it static or dynamic? It's important to define all of these big picture things. How will you build it? Will you be using a content management system like Drupal or WordPress? Are there third-party integrations vital to its success? You have to think about all of those different factors as we're thinking about the technical limitations of what we're building. And then how will it be used? Is it informational or transactional? Will users be using it primarily on their phone, maybe on their desktop, anything and everything in between? So having an understanding of all of these aspects of great UX will ensure you're creating something that meets your objectives. But in this process, you're going to have questions. So how will you answer them? And that's where it's important to find out how you can understand your users. There's this really great thing called the user research spectrum or landscape. Basically, there are a lot of different user research methodologies that you can apply And they all fit along kind of these two axes. So you might think of them as types of questions. So some are qualitative, like why and how to fix it. Some are quantitative, like how many and how much. Some are attitudinal, what people say. And some are behavioral, what people do. Each of these research methods is really useful in answering different questions along these axes. And if you look at it as it's plotted, you might see something like this, a chart like this. And if we're thinking about different activities, they might show up on the chart here. So maybe this one in the top here is more behavioral, but qualitative. Over here, it's behavioral, but quantitative. So those can be really helpful in determining what kind of activities you want to figure out and whether you want to look at more data-driven research or experiential research. There's a really fantastic article that was put out recently by the Nielsen Norman Group, who are basically the industry experts when it comes to user experience and user experience research. And I highly recommend you check this out. They plot 20 different research methods across this landscape, and it's really insightful. So as we're thinking about all these different methods that we can use, I want to ask you, what's in your toolbox? So today I'm going to walk you through 6 of my favorite things to do on projects, because I think they have the most impact or the most bang for your buck. And these are a few of my favorites: goals and KPIs, brand personality, audiences and personas, task analysis, journey mapping, and card sorting. Now we're going to fire up a quick poll here to see if any of you have experience with any of these. Everybody a minute or two there. All right, fantastic. Looks like, wow, for the most part, we've got at least one person on everything. A lot of people have tried card sorting and developing audiences and personas, journey mapping. Some people have looked into goals and KPIs and brand personality, and just one person has done some task analysis. All right, well, let's get started talking about each of these different methods. And to start, we're going to look at goals and KPIs. So what is it? Goals and KPIs are used to set objectives for a project and define concrete ways to measure the project's success. So those key performance indicators. When should it happen? As early as possible when starting a new project. Of course, you want to set the goals before you start the work. Otherwise, the goals are meaningless, right? And who should be involved? Well, goals and KPIs should be established by team members with an understanding of both the organization and the individual project. You want to make sure that you have a broad spectrum of stakeholders involved in defining the goals and KPIs for a project. So how does it work? Well, when we do goals and KPIs, we identify first why a website exists, right? What is its purpose? And then we look at specifically this project we're taking on. So whether that's redesigning a website, adding a new feature, whatever it may be, you need to define those individual project goals. And then finally, the last step, how are you going to measure success, right? You may think, well, did we achieve the goal? How are we going to test this? How are we going to determine whether we've achieved that goal? Defining those KPIs can be vital in determining whether you've met your goals that you set out to achieve at the start of a project. When we approach a project, we often outline a number of project goals. Again, we try not to look at, you don't want to have 15 different goals for a project. That might be unachievable. You want to try to keep them concise and somewhat broad. But then when you get into the key performance indicators, that's where you want to really think about how are we going to measure these? Looking at analytics, looking at traffic, looking at how users are using the site, how our organization is impacted by the website. Those are the things you can outline in detail. One thing that I want to think about with each of these activities is, how does it work virtually versus in person? Well, the nice thing about goals and KPIs is that it's basically something you can write down in any kind of document. So it works just as well virtually or in person. What's most important is that you have active collaboration between all of the people involved in the team. So whether it's an in-house team at a university or you're working with a vendor, you want to make sure that everyone has input on this to make sure that you're establishing goals that can be achieved and defining those key KPIs that you can use to determine whether you were successful. And then finally, what are the outcomes? Well, the nice thing about goals is that they keep a project focused on what's most important. If down the road you're saying, well, we need to make a decision about which direction we're taking with this, that's where you can revisit those goals and say, you know what, when we set out, we said we wanted to increase membership signups on the website. Going with option A helps increase membership signups, while going with option B doesn't. And that can be a way to help determine which path to take as you reach those forks in the road. And then finally, KPIs. They will help us determine if we've actually met the goals we set out to achieve. The nice thing about KPIs is that you can continue to evolve them throughout the life of a website. So you may have KPIs that when you launch the website make sense, but need to be adjusted later. Maybe their traffic is shifting, or because of the redesign, there are new avenues that users are exploring more. So you want to start measuring those. So you might need new KPIs. Now I want to talk about brand personality. So brand personality is an activity that we like to do to help identify what drives an organization and the way people feel about an organization. There are many different approaches we can take with this. Ideally, we start brand personality workshops at the start of a project, but often brand personality can be developed well before a project even begins. So you might already have some of this defined in any branding guidelines you might have for your organization. So typically it's called voice and tone or something along that line, or characteristics, adjectives, things to describe your organization and how people perceive your organization. Brand personality can be developed with input from members from the organization as well as outside users. So you may have internal opinions about how to describe your personality, but there might also be perception, right? You want to factor in how do users see us versus what we think. So that might be a way you can evaluate your personality as an organization. And how does it work? Well, when we approach this, we typically define a list of 30 to 40 potential attributes. That's a rough number. That number can grow or shrink. It all depends on the team you're working with and how quickly you might be able to work through them. The more words you have added to this list, the longer it's going to take to sort things. Sometimes when we approach this, we sort attributes into groups of maybe no, definitely not, maybe sometimes, and definitely. And then we choose attributes from the definitely list that best describe the organization. So this helps us think about how we can describe the organization and how we can represent the organization using content and design later in a project. And then sometimes we'll even determine where each term goes too far. Let's take a look at that. So we often do an exercise called this, but not that. So after we've defined those core terms, then we'll look at where are they pushing the limit, right? So you might think, well, there's a spectrum. So maybe on this end is this, but on that end is that. So when we worked with Human Rights Watch, it was really important that we established the personality of their website and that their photography should be used in an emotive way, but not a sensational way. So it's not that there was a polar opposite. It was more of a kind of an end or a limit to how far we could go with when we're using that photography. So with some clients, we've developed sort of a card sorting activity. So we work with them virtually or in person to sort things into different groupings. And then within that activity, we'll expand on it in a this but not that exercise. Other approaches are dot voting. So we'll create sort of a grid of different attributes and let audiences or let participants add dots that are color coded to them so that we can do sort of a group think and determine which of these gets the most votes, and that'll help us sort of prioritize those adjectives. And of course, we like to do this in person too. The nice thing about doing it in person is that you get a lot of collaboration, a lot of discussion, and it's very easy to add new cards and add new ideas. So I would say that in-person works really well for sorting attributes into groups and encourages discussion. Virtual activities work well too and can be done as a discussion or asynchronously using a card sorting tool. And I'll talk about tools a little bit later on. So what are the outcomes? Well, the nice thing about the brand personality is that it creates a clear understanding of the aspects of the personality of the organization that can be then used later to guide more work that happens throughout the life of a project. So let's say we're looking at developing a design and we want to make sure that it's personable but vibrant, something like that. That can help guide that work. All right, audiences and personas. So we talked a little bit earlier about audiences. We like to really define audiences and personas early on at the start of a project because this is who we're building the website for. So audiences and personas help to broadly define the target audience groups, prioritize those groups, and align on other audience-related objectives. UX personas are fictional characters created from qualitative research that represents a specific user segment. Audience groups can be established at the start of a project, and personas based on those groups should follow immediately. You may also already have audiences established. Again, like if you already have brand guidelines, if you already have some of that work done to understand who you're communicating with and who's using your products, you might have those groups already established. So who should be involved? Well, when we look at developing audiences and personas, it's really important to have representation from across an organization because everyone within an organization has a different relationship with their external audience. So if it's maybe someone who works at a ticket counter in a museum might have a very different experience than someone who's working in collections and working with researchers. And it's important that all of those different groups are represented. So as we look at audiences, how do they work? So first we define the key audience groups, and then we describe each group using 1 to 2 sentences. It's fairly simple. And then we document how they learn about the website. It's really important. This goes back to that background. So where are they coming from and how are they getting to your website? And then what are the key tasks that this group will need to complete on the website? This is where we can start to see where those different audiences segment, right? What makes them different and where do they overlap? And we look at personas, for each audience group, we create a unique persona to represent that group. So using information from user research, we'll often do stakeholder surveys, user surveys, focus groups, interviews, all sorts of different types of conversations and fact-finding you can do with users. We'll start to develop these personas and we'll add things like passions, their goals or their tasks, their challenges, and demographic information specific to the group if it's relevant. It's also important to make sure the persona accurately represents the audience group and isn't too general. So for a recent project, we developed different audience groups. So general visitors to a museum versus say museum sector. So people who actually work at another museum and kind of looked at the different tasks that those groups might have taken on the website and how there might be overlap between all of those. Then we developed personas. So these are personas from another project. It's really important to make a persona feel real. These are not meant to be real people, but they're supposed to feel as real as possible. So that's why you'll see things in here like their age, their background, some quotes. We often use photos. There's actually a website called This Person Does Not Exist, which generates AI photos of people. So they're not actual people, which is kind of fun. And then we start to fill in some of that background around those users or around those personas. For other projects, we'll create things like this, where we're kind of building these interactive components that we can then use in other activities that we do, which I'll show you in just a bit when we get to journey mapping. But this helps to keep those personas front of mind as we're doing other work later in the project. So for virtual or in person, this one, collaboration is key. You need to be able to share audiences and personas and make changes. The final artifacts, whatever they may be, should be in a format that can be referenced and shared later. That's really important. What we want to establish here is empathy for these different personas, so that later when we're talking about maybe a project, we can say, well, what would Margot do in this situation? Or what would Ben do in this situation? And that helps to keep us focused on user-focused activities instead of subjective feelings. So what are the outcomes? Well, we have a concrete list of the different groups the website serves. And then we have user personas that can be used to inform future discussions and phases throughout a project. And most importantly, this helps to build empathy for users gained from having those detailed personas. All right, the next activity I like is the task analysis. And the task analysis is an activity that helps identify and prioritize the top 10 to 15 user-centered tasks. This should happen soon after establishing goals and defining audience groups and personas, because you're going to need all of that as you're thinking about these top tasks that happen on your website. Who should be involved? Internal teams and users can both be involved in parts of this process. That's the beauty of generating these kind of task lists. You can poll users and try to understand what are the top things you're trying to do when using the website, or you can poll internal teams and get their idea for what they think users might be doing. So how does it work? When we look at a top task or a task analysis, we identify critical tasks first. So these are tasks that are vital to the success of the organization. Then we identify common tasks most users will do. And I've got 80-20 rule here. So if 80% of the users might do this task, that's a common task. And that's a good rule of thumb to help eliminate some of those that are unique to maybe only one or two audience groups. And then we combine those lists. So we take everything from that critical tasks list and the common tasks list and put them together. And we group tasks that are similar and remove duplicates. And then we work through that list to prioritize things. And that helps us establish that task analysis. So here you can see an example from a recent project. So the critical tasks were things like obtaining tickets, finding basic visit information, planning a visit. Common tasks were similar, but here we've got maybe a calendar of events. Again, planning my visit, searching collections. And then finally, the top tasks. This is where we start to bring things together, and we can prioritize just by bolding content. Sometimes that's enough, or we could do a numbered list to say this is the most important task on the website. This activity works really well in person and virtually. Teams can brainstorm ideas and discuss what tasks are most important. We often do this in Google Docs, or we'll do it in a collaborative tool like Figma or FigJam. And the outcomes are that it helps to develop an understanding of the tasks that are important to the organization as well as the user. Again, trying to make sure that we're keeping a focus on the user throughout this work. It helps to prioritize tasks to help make objective decisions later in the project and identify areas that need more attention than they currently have. All right, up next, we've got journey mapping. So journey mapping is an activity that visualizes the process a user goes through in order to complete their goal. I love journey mapping. It should happen anytime during the life of a project, usually during points where key decisions need to be made, or you need to develop a key understanding of maybe a persona or an audience group. Internal teams looking to have a better understanding of the challenges faced by users will benefit greatly from journey mapping. So how does it work? Well, with journey mapping, we choose a persona. Then we create a scenario based on that persona's goals. Then we identify tasks that persona needs to complete. And then, this is where the magic happens, we walk through that scenario, noting each step. Throughout that process, we identify opportunities, and then we map the persona's mood throughout the exercise. So here you can see an example from a recent project where we had different audiences represented by personas, and they were each trying to do a different task on the website. And throughout this process, we noted each step that it would take, grouping them under headings. And then as we went, we identified opportunities. So these are the things that we might need to improve as we're looking at redesigning the website, or things that work really well that we want to make sure we don't lose as things change. And then finally, we mapped the mood of each of these personas. And you can see here that once they got down to this bottom line, that's an area where we really need to focus and make sure that we're improving that experience so that the line never dips that low on the new site. One thing I really love to do after going through a journey mapping exercise is to do some collaborative sketching. So let's say we just went through this experience. A student is looking to request information, and that's where they got the most frustrated. Well, what if that was a good experience for them? What could be better about that? Let's sketch ideas around that and try to improve that quickly on the call or in person. Again, this is a great way to collaborate and brainstorm and keep that user front of mind as we're looking at developing solutions for the website. So we've run this exercise both virtually and in person. Virtually, it can be more of a guided exercise where participants can see a shared screen, much like you're seeing right now, and they can contribute ideas. In person, each participant can create their own journey map and then share the results. Each of those runs a little bit differently and you get different results, but they're both really great no matter what you do. Highly encouraged doing some journey mapping. So what are the outcomes? So the nice thing about journey mapping, again, is that it's building empathy for the persona, for the user, and the challenges they face. Often we'll go through this journey mapping exercise and a client will say, "Well, I didn't even realize how challenging this was," or "I didn't know that I'd have to totally abandon the website and call someone to find that next step." So you can find some really major and minor issues that need additional work. And it can help identify opportunities for improvement. So maybe there's a feature you hadn't considered, but during this journey mapping exercise, it kind of came to light that, wow, that would really help this user achieve that goal that they set out to achieve. All right, finally, I'm going to talk about card sorting. So card sorting is a UX method in which users organize topics into groups. It's fairly simple. Card sorting should happen after audiences and personas are established, but before any other information architecture. So when we look at card sorting, we're looking to build the sitemap of a website. So we want to find out how are users grouping the content together. So ideally, real users representing each audience group should be involved. Card sorting can be done by internal teams with a good understanding of the individual personas as well. We've done both, and sometimes it can be used as an alignment exercise. So you might have users do a card sort and internal teams do a card sort and then see the difference. How do we see our content versus what our audiences see? So again, fairly simple. You define the terms, you gather participants. We recommend about 15 participants for a card sort, and then you run the workshop. So basically you provide people with the cards and they organize them into the groups that make sense to them. And then you can analyze the results. That's a real big picture look at it. There are two types of card sorts. There's an open card sort where nothing is labeled. You only have the cards with terms on them. and then the group or the person can put them into groups and then label each group. Or there's the closed card sort, where you already have those groupings established and the user is just moving the cards into those pre-established groups. Again, we've done these in person and virtually. In person, it's really great. First, you get to offer candy. People love candy, so that's fun. But it's a great opportunity to hear how a person actually thinks about the content they're working with. So we often tell people, talk out loud as you're sorting things. We want to hear your thoughts. We want to hear discussion. And it's a great way to get some insight that you might not get virtually. Of course, you can also do this online. The nice thing about doing it online is that you can have almost any number of users do it. You could have 15, you could have 500. The more users, the better. But there is a bit of a difference, right? So it'll be more data-driven versus experiential. So like I said, virtual card sorts can provide data to inform architecture decisions. And then it's easier to include more users in a virtual card sort. For in-person card sorting, you get to see how users approach grouping content and listen as they discuss their decisions, which provides a lot of insight not gained from a virtual card sort. So what are the outcomes? Well, this helps us categorize different pieces of content and gives us insight into how users might think about grouping that content. I would caution that the labels established in a card sort aren't necessarily what you need to use when you're developing a sitemap, but they can help influence your decisions. And then finally, I wanted to go over a few of the tools that we use while we're doing these activities. And I'm going to start with some, I guess, whiteboarding, prototyping tools. So the three here that I've listed are Figma, Mural, and Miro. All of these have a really great tool set of collaboration aspects to them. I would highly recommend checking out Figma and FigJam, which I think has a free educational plan. So if you work in higher ed or if you're working at a university, anything like that, I think you can use it for free, and that would really help perform some of these activities. And then for testing, I mentioned card sorting. Optimal Workshop is the go-to website or tool for card sorting and tree testing. You can also use it for that brand personality exercise. So if you're sorting those adjectives into different columns, you can use it there as well. But most importantly, use what works for you. All of these tools are tools, right? And I may use a hammer, you may use a screwdriver, but you're going to get different results depending on what you're most comfortable with. So I would highly recommend finding that tool that works best for what you're trying to do. So what's next? I love this picture. I don't know what that guy's up to. So user experience is ever changing. And what I'd like to stress is that testing goes beyond usability testing. You need to make sure that you're checking all of the boxes. So you need to have a holistic approach to testing and including users in your work. And that means usability testing, accessibility testing, and developing things that are device agnostic. So whether that's a website, it needs to work on a phone just as well as it works on a desktop, or an application. You need to make sure that you're meeting those users where they're coming from. And if you don't test, you're just making assumptions. So it's really important to test those assumptions and ensure that you're creating a product that your users actually want to use.